Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Andrew Johnson is the subject of this video, the most controversial president easily in United States history. You know the basic facts. He's the pro-Union Tennessee senator, the U.S. senator, military governor of Tennessee after the war begins, takes on the role of vice president to Abraham Lincoln, and following Lincoln's assassination, becomes the 17th president of the United States. His single term in the White House is crazy. He stands in opposition to the 14th Amendment. He ushers in a form of Reconstruction that ultimately fails. And if that wasn't enough, he's the first president to be impeached. You think you know him, right? But what was he like as a leader, as charismatic person that he really was? It was a fascinating view of Johnson and how he was unafraid and courageous. It's written by James Fowler Rusling. I've profiled some of Rusling's work in previous videos. He was the guy as a staff officer in the Army of the Potomac, served a bunch of generals, names you would know, Meade, Hooker. He was at Gettysburg with Sickles when Sickles was wounded. He was all over the place, got to know all of these generals and politicians, including Lincoln and Johnson. Rusling writes profiles of all of these men in his book in the late 1890s titled Men and Things I Saw in the Civil War. He's really fascinated with Johnson because he saw him on 3 occasions. Early in the war, actually right around the inauguration of Lincoln on the eve of war, and then in the war, and then after the war. So let me share these reminiscences from Rusling because it really paints an interesting picture of Johnson. The first meeting involves an incident that included the Star of the West. I want to set this up for you. There's a mention of the Star of the West. It was a support vessel sent by James Buchanan in his waning days as president, January of 1861. The Star of the West headed down to Charleston to resupply the beleaguered garrison in Charleston Harbor. And Major Robert Anderson is in command of that garrison, Fort Sumter, and the Star of the West is turned back before it can deliver the supplies. So know that going in because it makes the story easier to follow. So here we go, Rusling's account, his reminiscences of Johnson. He says, I became interested in Andrew Johnson before the war as a senator from Tennessee and an advocate of the Homestead Bill when all other Southern senators, I believe, were hostile to it. This bill proposed to divide our Western territories into small farms of 160 acres each, and to give them to actual settlers there, and therefore was in the interest of free labor. And of course, the South opposed it because it was hostile to slave labor. Johnson, nevertheless, courageously supported it, Congress after Congress, but it never became a law until the Southern statesmen seceded, and then the Republican majority placed it on the statute book, and under its wise and beneficent provisions, the Great West soon became an empire of small farmers. I always thought Andrew Johnson deserved credit for his manly advocacy of this bill, antagonistic as it was to his own section. Therefore, I was not surprised to see him take his stand by the Union in the dark winter of 1860 to 61, when the whole South, as a rule, went drifting to treason and rebellion. I saw him first in March 1861 in the Senate chamber at Washington, D.C. I think it was March 3rd, on the invitation of an old and valued friend from Trenton, New Jersey, now a millionaire several times over, Samuel K. Wilson, Esquire, the best friend I ever had. I'd gone down there to Washington to see Lincoln inaugurated in common with many Republicans from the North, and on March 3rd, found myself and my friend in the Senate gallery listening to the Southern senators as they made their farewell speeches. Among them was Wigfall of Texas. He said, in substance, in his most bitter and eloquent style, "The Star of the West, flying your flag, swaggered into Charleston Harbor with supplies for Fort Sumter. South Carolina struck her between the eyes, and she staggered back. And now, what do you propose to do about it?" Wigfall sat down, and for a time, nobody responded. It was a bitter taunt and defiance to the Union. And yet, Seward and Sumner, Cameron and Chandler and Crittenden, and all the rest sat silent until the silence grew painful. Then, suddenly, uprose Andrew Johnson, and, in the midst of a stillness that could almost be felt, he said substantially, "Mr. President, I will tell the senator from Texas what I would do about it. I speak only for myself, but if I were president, as James Buchanan today is, and as Abraham Lincoln tomorrow will be, I would arrest the senator and his friends on the charge of high treason. I would have them tried by a jury of their countrymen, and, if convicted, by the eternal God, I would hang them." He sat down as if shot, and for a minute or so the silence was even profounder than before. Then, up in one corner of the gallery, an unknown man sprang to his feet and, waving his hat, shouted out, "3 cheers for Andrew Johnson." 3,000 Northerners crowded the galleries, but we rose as one man and gave 3 mighty cheers, such as the American Senate had never heard before. Of course, it was a breach of the privileges of the Senate, and John C. Breckinridge, a double-eyed traitor, later to become a Confederate general, who sat in the vice president's chair, immediately ordered the galleries cleared. Again, the unknown man called out, "And now, 3 cheers for the Union." And we gave these even mightier than before, amid the tossing of hats and waving of handkerchiefs. And then we filed out into the corridors of the Capitol, men shouting and hurrahing, and some even crying like children. This was my first personal experience of Andrew Johnson, and I confess, greatly impressed me in his favor. Soon afterward, he went home to Tennessee by way of Virginia, and his life threatened en route because he was a Union man, and I did not see him again until November 1863, when I was ordered to Nashville and found him there in office as military governor of Tennessee. He had his headquarters in the classic state capitol there, which he had fortified and barricaded and filled with troops, loyal East Tennesseans, and stood ready for legislation or battle as the day might bring forth. From then on to February 1865, when he left for Washington to be inaugurated as vice president, I saw a great deal of him, and he always bore himself as a hero and a statesman. From early morning until late in the afternoon, he was usually in the executive chamber listening to the pathetic tales of the refugees and freedmen who crowded to him for counsel or relief from all parts of Tennessee, or else he was devising ways and means for their shelter and subsistence, or providing for their due enrollment in Union regiments and batteries. There was no one so humble or ragged or destitute that Johnson could not approach, or that he could not approach as excellently with the tale of woe, and no one left his presence without aid or comfort of some sort. He early recognized the importance of freeing the slaves and enlisting them on the side of the Union, and our freedmen had no truer friend in Tennessee than Andrew Johnson during all those dark days. In personal appearance and deportment, he was a model American statesman of those years, and was greatly honored and esteemed by all who came in contact with him, except rebels and traitors. Of course, These latter hated him bitterly, with an intensity of hatred inconceivable to Northerners. But all the same, Andrew Johnson held on his course, and in the darkest hours there, as after Chickamauga and before Nashville, when the hearts of men like Stanton and Grant even misgave them, he, quote, bated no jot of heart or hope, but still bore up and steered right forward, end quote. It is enough to his credit to say that he possessed the absolute confidence of Rosecrans, of Thomas, of Sherman, of Grant, of all who commanded out there, as well as of President Lincoln, while the rank and file of our Union troops were enthusiastic in Johnson's behalf. In February 1865, Johnson left for Washington, and I did not see him again until August of that year, when I happened to be in Washington and called at the White House to pay my respects to him as president. He was apparently the same simple, affable, approachable American citizen as previously, patriotically and Union-loving to the core. How he afterward came to cast himself into the arms of his old enemies during our baleful period of Reconstruction has always been to me a mystery and a puzzle. In September or October 1865, I was one of a committee of Jersey men to call upon him in the interest of our freedmen and of the 15th Amendment, and he was still staunch and steadfast in their behalf. When afterward he turned his back upon them, though once posing as their Moses, and upon all his own Union record, it was as if the sun had gone out at midday or another star had fallen. Like Lucifer, son of the morning, or Julian, the apostate, or Benedict Arnold, indeed, human politics is a queer profession and often a sad business. How often a disappointed statesman in his declining years turns upon his life record and seeks to rend it and his old friends to pieces and to tear down and destroy what he was a lifetime in building up. As V-Day Webster, Seward, Sumner, Greeley, and Andrew Johnson, not to mention others elsewhere or of more recent times. God save any man from such a fate. In 1866 to 1867, I was absent, south and west, on long tours of Army inspection and did not see President Johnson again until September 1867. Meanwhile, he had become embroiled with Congress and General Grant and had swung around the circle to the other side, while I had continued steadfast in the faith as a Republican. My Army service was now ended, having resigned and been ordered mustered out, and I called at the White House to say goodbye. He kindly asked about my future and made proffer of his services, but we were now traveling on different roads, and, of course, I could not avail myself of his good offices. I never saw him afterward, but can never forget his sterling patriotism and superb heroism in the days when they were most needed. Personally, he was certainly honest and incorruptible. He was loyal to his friends and true to his word. He had absolute faith in the people and meant well by the Republic, and with all his errors and mistakes, due largely to his time in section and education, or rather want of education, I have nevertheless always kept a warm place in my heart for Andrew Johnson. Abraham Lincoln loved and trusted him, and had Abraham Lincoln lived, Andrew Johnson would have turned out a different man. So there you have it. Rusling's account of Andrew Johnson, the man transformed, according to Rusling, by his time of office. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.